So here's a mil-spec AR15 lower assembly and some of the tools that I'm using. I use a T-handle hex wrench, 3/16. I use a couple of punch pins, and these Real Avid extended bolt catch roll pin starters are really handy. I use an armorer's wrench and a pair of needle nose pliers. And some of the parts that you'll need is a fire control group, your trigger of choosing, your buffer spring, your receiver extension, castle nut, end plate, lower parts kit, your grip, and your grip screw. And obviously your stripped lower receiver. I kind of got a few comments asking about the buffer retainer pin, so I kind of wanted to go over some of the things and some details that I missed last time. This is an Aero Precision M4E1 strip lower, and it has an integrated trigger guard and a few upgraded enhancements in it, but I'll go over that later. This is your magazine catch body, which is attached to a magazine catch spring, or you put it into the magazine catch body. And then you have your magazine catch button, which you'll thread onto your magazine catch body. There is a textured portion. That's the portion that will be facing upwards, or the portion that your finger will be hitting. And then you have your bolt catch buffer, and your bolt catch spring. And you'll have a bolt catch roll pin, but on an M4E1 lower, you will not need the roll pin. And do not put it in this hole. I just kind of did that because there's two holes right next to each other, and sometimes you'll put it in the wrong hole, but it should fall right through, so it should be pretty obvious. Like I mentioned before, you do not need this bolt catch roll pin, but if you have a regular mil-spec lower, you'll punch it into the hole into your bolt catch. Now, I call both these pins takedown pins, but the larger pin is actually called your pivot pin, and the smaller pin is actually your takedown pin. The pivot pin goes in the front, and the takedown pin goes in the rear. And then you have your takedown pin springs and your detents. And a lot of people can get the safety selector spring and safety selector detent mixed up with your pivot pin and takedown pin springs and detents. And you can kind of tell which one is which by your safety detent is the one with the flat side, and your takedown detents are actually double-sided. The next parts that I'll be showing are your buffer retainer and your buffer retainer spring. And that will hold your buffer spring into your receiver extension. And it goes in the little hole in the back portion by the threading. And this last little part was in my Aero Precision lower parts kit, and it's a threaded set screw that will hold in your takedown detent and your detent spring. It's really only for M4E1 lowers again, and I won't utilize it in this video, but you can use it for an M4E1. With your receiver extension, your end plate, and your castle nut, you'll have a raised edge on your end plate that will go towards the lower. And then the castle nut will have little indentations that you use your armorer's wrench to tighten. That will go towards your brace or your stock or away from the lower. And I thread the castle nut as far as you can thread on the receiver extension, and then I align my castle or my end plate on the receiver extension. And then the buffer spring and buffer weight, these come together. It's pretty self-explanatory. And your grip screw. I kind of keep my grip screw in the bottom of my grip. The next part I'll be showing is my fire control group. It's just a regular mil-spec fire control group. It is nickel Teflon. It's a single stage, but I figured I'd do a regular mil-spec fire control group installation on this lower. Okay, so this front pivot pin can give people a little bit of trouble. You stick in your spring first, and then I like to take a pair of needle nose pliers and kind of just get it with the tip of the needle nose pliers. and I'll kind of help guide it into the hole because you'll have some tension on that spring. And then as I'm pushing down with the needle nose pliers, I'll take the edge of the pivot pin and I'll push down on that detent. And what you're going to want to do is not align that channel with the detent just yet. You kind of want to use, it's going to be like a smooth side, and you just push down until you can get the pivot pin started into the hole. Don't push it all the way in yet. I kind of messed up. You don't want the channel facing upwards, but you kind of want it facing to the side, or 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, something like that. You're going to want to push the pivot pin in. And then when you get it sort of almost all the way in, then you can align the channel with the detent. And then obviously it'll snap in place. You'll hear a nice click and you'll do a function check on your pivot pin. The bolt catch is another part that gives people a lot of issues too. And that's because they're trying to install a roll pin and they're trying to use a roll pin set from weird angles. I do suggest hitting it from the side that has the threads where your receiver extension goes in, as you'll see in the video. You want to hit it in from this side, and I highly recommend these Real Avid bolt catch pin starters kits. I think it's like 12 bucks, but it's really helped me out. Fortunately for an M4E1 lower, you have a set screw for your bolt catch installation, and you take your buffer and your buffer spring for your bolt catch. You put it in the top hole, and then you're going to take your bolt catch. People call it a ping pong paddle, and you want to put the paddle side up, and you just throw it into that little slot. And what you're going to want to do with a roll pin is sometimes you have to kind of press down on the paddle to relieve a little bit of tension and just hit that roll pin in. And then obviously with the set screw, you just screw it in. It's super simple, super easy. This is actually the first M4E1 lower that I've utilized, so I kind of really appreciate the set screw. One thing that I do recommend for a roll pin, that includes the roll pin on your trigger guard or this bolt catch, is I do throw a little bit of oil or a little bit of grease on the roll pins, and that kind of helps the roll pin get started, and it won't allow the roll pin to seize up into those little holes. You also want to be careful at not mushrooming your roll pin either. And after every part installation, I do like to do a function check just to make sure the part's working correctly. The magazine catch installation is pretty simple. This is one of the easier parts to put in. You're going to take your magazine catch body, and it's pretty obvious which side the magazine catch body you have to put it in. So you just throw in your magazine catch body onto the side with your serial numbers, and then you're going to take your magazine catch spring and put it around the body. The hardest part about this is getting your magazine catch button started onto the threading. And don't forget, the textured portion is facing upwards. Rotate the magazine catch body a couple of times clockwise. That way you can start the threading. And then I like to take a decent size punch and push on the magazine catch button. And then I can continue to thread on the magazine catch body. And what I like to do is I like to get the tip of the body flush with the end of the magazine catch button. That is technically the correct way to install a magazine catch. Yeah, ignore this part here because I was trying to figure out if I was going to install my trigger or my safety first. As in my last video, I installed my trigger first and then I couldn't install my safety. But for a mil-spec trigger, you actually have to install the portion of the trigger first. And you're going to have a couple of parts. You have your trigger, your trigger spring, your disconnector, and your disconnector spring. You take your disconnector spring, you put it into a little hole that your disconnector spring should fit right into. And then you have a little notch for your disconnector, and it should line up the holes. And those holes kind of have to be lined up, and your disconnector and your spring can fall out. So just be aware of that when you're installing it, at least. I personally like to use a slave pin, but you can use a punch pin as a slave pin as well. And this just helps the installation when you're hammering in your hammer pin. Sometimes aligning up the disconnector hole with your hammer hole and just getting it started can be a little tricky because your trigger can't, and sometimes that disconnector hole won't be lined up properly. So it might take you a few times to get the trigger installation done, but just keep at it. It's pretty simple. And usually once you get a slave pin in there, your hammer pin should easily be tapped in, and use a non-marring hammer. Okay, next I'm going to install my safety selector and my grip. And the safety selector and the grip kind of have to be installed at the same time. For your regular 90-degree throw mil-spec safety, you want to insert it from the serial number side. And then I like to put the lower upside down and put the detent in. And the detent, you want the flat side on the bottom, but since it's upside down, it's going to be facing up. And again, your safety selector spring and your pivot pin spring can get mixed up sometimes. The safety selector spring's coils are a little bit thicker and a little bit larger in diameter. The safety selector spring is also going to be a little bit shorter. And then in your grip, you're going to have a hole, and you're going to want to put your safety selector spring in the hole of your grip. And then I like to take the grip screw in my T-handle. I believe it's a 3/16 T-handle hex wrench. You can use a flathead for some of these grip screws, but I like to use this hex wrench. And I go ahead and put it all the way into the hole. And then I'm going to not lose the spring, and then slowly thread on the grip screw. It's a pretty simple process, pretty easy installation. And then once you get your grip screw mostly threaded on, you're going to want to take your safety selector and either put it on fire or safe. You'll either get some feedback that the detent's in place, or you'll hear a nice satisfying click. And then you can test out your safety selector. The hammer installation can be hard, and that's because you have tension on the hammer spring. And you can actually install the hammer spring the wrong direction, and you want to install it in the orientation that you see here. You're also going to want to put your safety selector on fire. Otherwise, the hammer won't be able to seat all the way down, and you won't be able to line up the holes. I definitely think you're going to need to use a slave pin. I haven't been able to do this without one. As you can see, there is a lot of tension on that hammer, and you should have a lot of tension on the hammer, especially for a mil-spec hammer. And it's pretty simple. I think it's easier than the trigger because you don't have to worry about aligning the disconnector like you do with the trigger. And then once you've got the slave pin started, this is where it can get a little tricky too. Just keep on wiggling around the hammer until you line up the holes. And this part is hard because you can't see the holes when the hammer pin is in there while you're trying to hammer it in. So you kind of have to do your best just to kind of eyeball it. And like I said, it might take you a little bit, but just keep at it and you should get those aligned at some point. Don't force it though. Don't hit the hammer pin incredibly hard. If it's not going in relatively easy, just stop and realign. And I've never been able to hammer in the hammer pin all the way. It will always stick out just a little bit because right before you hammer it all the way, it becomes unaligned. And I became a little impatient here and I was thinking, well, I can just hammer it in. But really what you need to do is just eyeball it. You can see the alignment and you should be able to push it in with your finger from the backside. Then always do a function check with your trigger. You want to make sure that the hammer drops, but you don't want to drop it on your lower receiver, as it can crack the lower receiver. You want to make sure your trigger resets, and you want to make sure that your trigger won't fire while on safe. And I still like to make sure that my thumb's in front of that hammer, even on safe, in case the hammer drops, as like I mentioned before, you don't want to crack your lower receiver. So your rear takedown pin, you can see there's a little bit of crud in the channels. I do like to grease the channels of both my pivot and takedown pins, only because the detent can be a little bit tight and that grease kind of helps the detent smooth out a little bit. But you're going to stick your detent and then your detent spring into the hole in the back. And then you're going to take your receiver extension with your end plate and your castle nut and start threading it onto your lower receiver. Now, I personally also like to grease the threading of my receiver extension with anti-seize, and that's just to season the threads, as I'll eventually stake the castle nut, or I'll have a locking castle nut and end plate eventually down the road for this lower receiver. But I put anti-seize on my barrel nut and my threading for my barrel nut, and I do the same for my receiver extension. But go ahead and thread it down until the edge of the receiver extension is right before that hole. And then you're going to put your buffer retainer and your buffer retainer spring into the hole. Take your punch pin and you're going to want to push down on your buffer retainer on the dimpled portion of the buffer retainer, and you want to push down all the way. Be careful not to slip, as that will make your buffer retainer and your spring go shooting into orbit. And you should only have to turn your receiver extension about a quarter turn before it catches that buffer retainer. Then I like to turn it around and make sure that the takedown spring isn't kinked. And then I like to take my end plate once I've ensured that the takedown spring isn't kinked, and I like to push down on the end plate, catching the takedown pin spring, and then I'll just hand tighten the castle nut, and I'll do a function check on the rear takedown pin, because if the detent isn't in the channel, you should pull out your takedown pin all the way, and then you'll have to do the installation all over again. But you want to ensure that the channels are facing rearward towards the receiver extension. And then I'll continue to tighten down the castle nut, take my armorer's wrench, and then really torque down that castle nut. And this is why I use anti-seize grease, because when you really torque down that castle nut, you can open up the threadings, and that anti-seize helps that castle nut not to seize on your receiver extension. And all you have left to do for this portion of your lower receiver is put in your buffer spring and buffer weight. I cock the hammer, put it on safe just to make sure that the hammer doesn't fall, and then your buffer weight and buffer spring should go right into the receiver extension. You want to make sure that the buffer weight is facing towards the barrel or the hammer, and then I want to make sure that all my parts are functioning, and that includes the pivot pin, takedown pin, bolt catch, magazine catch, trigger, safety. Then I'll push on the buffer spring just to make sure everything works. One thing of note, you can't really test your bolt catch if your hammer is down, as that's putting friction on the bolt catch. So you have to cock the hammer in order to do a real function check on that bolt catch once everything is put together. The only thing left is choosing whether you want a brace or a stock on your strip lower. My lower is going to be a pistol, so I'm putting a brace on it, but please understand all your local and federal laws before installing. If you bought a complete lower with a stock on it, you cannot put a brace on it. So most of my lowers start their lives as pistols, as I can put a stock on it later if I want to, but just make sure you understand all the laws before doing anything. This isn't any sort of legal advice. The very last thing that I do is I like to put a complete upper on my lower and do a complete function check. Make sure everything works. Make sure that the takedown and the pivot pins snap in. I check the trigger. I make sure I can do all the adjustments on my brace or my stock. I can charge the handle. I like to take an empty magazine. Obviously ensure that it's empty before inserting it. The magazine's a little bit tight, but I think that's because it's a brand new lower. But I like to charge the handle, make sure that the bolt locks back. I'll take out the magazine, make sure that I can drop the bolt, make sure the magazine also drops freely, and just do a function check. And since this is a pistol lower, I'm using a shortened barreled upper for this lower just to test out. And that should do it for building a complete lower receiver from all strip parts, mostly mil spec, other than the M4E1 lower with a few enhancements. But if you have any questions about how to build a lower, or if you're having any issues, please feel free to put them in the comment section below. I will try to answer all of them. You can also go online to AR15.com. There's Reddit. There's a lot of really helpful websites out there that can help you with either building a lower receiver or upper receiver. I'll be doing an upper receiver build here in a video here soon.